I'd like to bring out Johan and Kivi, who's... Hey, welcome, Johan. Kivi and Johan, forgive me if I'm not being fair and generalizing the Nordic cultures of modernism, but it seems like you two were very interested in making the digital into something, let's say, more personal and expressive, and we're trying to find the effects of the digital maybe a little bit more than the geometry or the technique. Is that a fair thing to say?
Absolutely.
Sure.
No, I think that what is, to me, one thing that is super interesting about the digital is that I think actually there are individual expressions, individual styles emerging, despite the sort of streamlining of production and the streamlining of techniques and all of that. So definitely.
But you sensed that already then, before it was even being used?
No, I think it was intuitive, and I think it was driven by, certainly for me, and Kivi, you probably have, thank you so much. I think it was, for me it was, like I said, I think it was intuitive. I think it's driven by a certain, to me everything digital is about a materialism. It comes from certainly an interest in textiles that I had before, in fact, coming to the digital. But I also think it's and it's image. For me, it was very much image-driven. You know, I belong to that generation that grew up with magazines, where that in America, Interview magazine, in England, the Face, ID magazine. So, as opposed to a digital culture, that's the sort of youth growing up culture that I identify with. So, yeah, materialism, pictures.
And what you both were in London. Was the digital culture around the AA in London particularly different than other places at that time?
I think London was a kind of, to me, I think my first contact with the digital somehow had to do with the music that actually came out of London, drum and bass. And somehow intuited from the music that if you could use the computer to produce music where rhythm works in such a new way that you could use it as a design device to produce new effects. And I mean, to your previous question, I mean, I realized, I don't know if I realized it then, but I realized more and more, I'm somebody who comes from the Finnish tradition of architects who wanted to do total works of art and who don't see much of a difference between art, design, and architecture, and actually refuse to make that distinction. I can make it intellectually, but my attitude perhaps is that of an artist. And for me, the computer was always a tool to realize new effects, new artistic effects in the scale of architecture, in the scale of design, and sometimes in the context of art.
It seems like there was a struggle between the physical and the digital, in particular with the Jyväskylä project. But it also, I know both of you well enough to know you both care a lot about materials and process and making things. So could you talk about that?
Right. You know what we actually did that you don't see in the show is that we built every single one of our larger fantasy projects, like the Jyväskylä, we built it as an installation, a large urban steel structure, and built as a gallery project in Oslo, meaning that we took the essential architectural idea of articulating, using structure to articulate space in a particular way, and actually tested its effects on people in temporary projects. And also develop a lot of the design technique and engineering techniques that those structures required. So every project that we did together, there was always a physical realized project to accompany the digital unrealized architectural scale project.
There was a continuity in terms of project interest, and that I think, you know, that one project inherited things from the other very clearly, like you say, and they were in that sense also pursued in larger scale sort of prototype installations. However, I think it's also, with respect to your question, I think it's also good to point out or to remember that, so I arrived in Oslo after many years in London, and my own personal involvement with the digital was rather minimal. And what both of us then did, we managed to establish these groups, and this is what was called Ocean. So there was an Ocean group in Helsinki, there was an Ocean group in Oslo, and there were fantastic people working with that. I think one of the achievements for me was, in fact, despite very many of the ideas that emerged at this time, they were not necessarily new. I mean, they date back to the 1950s and 60s. However, it's very clear that the technology, the availability of the technology, that changed, and I think that the thinking or our way of relating to these things changed. So, but then in Ocean, what was really quite unique, I think it was an earnest attempt to somehow dismantle the genius architect, at least in the early years. So we really collaborated with a very flat structure. It was a groupie sort of rock and roll style show. And we had the blast going to Helsinki, drinking whiskey all day long and working on projects and going to nightclubs and then sleeping a little bit and back in the studio. And I think, but that also has a background or context to, for instance, compared to some of the best stuff that went on at the AA at the time, with John Fraser, for instance, and not to speak about what I can imagine went on in LA and in New York already earlier. I think that our relationship to the digital was fairly rudimentary. And I think that's probably explains a little bit of the struggle that you pointed out.
By the way, I remember it was Herbert Mouchamp who first told me about Ocean, and he said, "You don't know who Ocean is?" Kind of in that Andy Warhol, wow, they're fabulous.
Yeah. But actually what you say is interesting in relation to what you first asked, that there wasn't, I think our work didn't imply that it was ortholess or abstract. I think there was a very particular effect and a particular artistic effect what we were after. But it happened to be one that was polymorphic and that benefited from a group of people working together. So actually the way we would work, we would establish a kind of game. After we agree on the aims, we would sit together and say, this is what we desire, these are the effects, this is the impact we want to have on a city like Jyväskylä. And then we'd say, well, how do we go about choreographing the project? And we would set rules and we'd use the computer's ability to generate material and involve people. And our aesthetic was one that actually benefited from that multiplicity. And if we had, let's say, be hardcore minimalist, we couldn't have worked this way. But the more, richness we could acquire from different authors and from these techniques, the better for the project.
Yeah. So, but I think there were two things that I want to just ask you about. I mean, first, this idea of not authorless, but let's say a collective. I mean, I think Servo, probably even Bjarke and Big. I forget what the name of their office was. Plot or something.
Play.
Yeah.
Plot and Play.
It seems like that was something that was going on a lot. What I would say distinguished your group was focus on materials, like with Aki Menges and people like that. I think we're a legacy of that. But also what you called the impact on visitors or the impact on people experiencing things kind of at scale. Would you agree with that?
Yes, 100%. I always thought that every time you meet Frank Gehry, he tells the same story about meeting Alvar Aalto and how important that was, how he works in that tradition. And I always thought when you look at Gehry's work, one thing that he does very well is he works through models and understands scale and can evaluate the effect of architecture on people quite accurately. And I think we very much worked in this manner. I mean, it's a different kind of architecture, but we used models, installations, and had a real interest in understanding how these dreams that we had the kind of experiences they would engender and the kind of social spaces that we produced. And we had some pretty radical political ideas also of using architecture with agency to create more democratic spaces that challenge orders that be. And so it wasn't pure form or formal exercises. There was always an intent on intervening on culture through architecture.
There is that image and that sort of materiality that I refer to me, it's ultimately super sensual, and it's really vibrant, and it has I mean, I use one word when I really want to get excited about it. I think of it as fibrillious, something that is really super fine, and it's virtually physical. And so to me, and that's a spatial project eventually also.
And there's a digital project that came out of digital, or that predated it?
No, my fascination with textiles predated the digital, and then basically digital became a means for actually doing things that I couldn't do in terms of analog drawing. So I started that, and then together with partners, we were processing it and turning it into eventually the kind of particle streaming that you see also here.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we got to wrap it up.
Thank you.
Thanks, Johan.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Greg.
Kivi. Neil.
This is the Greg Lynn Show with Greg Lynn, produced by the CCA. I'm Kivi Sotamaa.
And I'm Johan Bettum. Thanks for watching.